An 8-year-old was reading me a story just the other day. The name of it was, I Wish I Had Duck Feet. Now, this is by Theo Lessig, who was one of those writers about the time of Dr. Seuss, and a lot of those books are out there. I don't know if you've seen this book. I hadn't seen this book before. But the theme is essentially, I wish I had duck feet. And he tells about 10 great things that he could do with duck feet, including splashing through puddles and whatnot. And how fun it would be. But then he begins to realize, but when I came into the house, Mom would chase me back outside because I'd track water everywhere. And so then he says, I wish I had an elephant nose. And he thinks of all the fun things he could do with an elephant trunk. But then he figures his dad would make him wash the car all the time. Okay? I wish I had deer antlers because then I could wear 10 hats at a time. But then I could never get on the school bus, which I was thinking about when I was a kid. That might have been still a good deal. I wish I had a tiger tail so I could pull my friends through the streets, but then Big Bill Brown might tie me into the tree. And so he comes to the final conclusion that I am happy that I am me. Now, for the last couple weeks, we have been talking about the theme of Jubilee. And one of the very first things that I said to you is, number one, people, when we start looking at other people's life, there might be some things that we really like, but at the same time, most of us wouldn't want to take on the baggage of someone else's life, right? I mean, there is no way that, you can take advice from people, but you don't want to live your life exactly like someone else. You want to live the life that God has crafted for you, okay? You don't want to be stuck with someone else's elephant nose or tiger tail because there's baggage with the way that everyone else lives in their life. But what I hope, and here's how I started, I am very thankful for my life. Incredibly thankful. And I hope that's where you are in your life. And to be able to say, you know what? I'm thankful I'm me. There's a million other things I could have been, but I am thankful I'm me. And there's a freedom that begins with this. Now, let me tell you what we've been talking about for these last few weeks, but I want to set that out there as an introduction. We've been talking about, for 6 days, God created, and on the 7th, He created a pattern for us. And that pattern was one of rest and worship. On the 7th day, we are to focus on God. But it was more than just that. Every 7 years, the land was to rest. And we practiced being able to turn ourselves more fully to God, to trust in Him. Will He provide? And then came this incredible gift of Jubilee, 7 periods of 7. And now there is this incredible freedom that God wants, if you've been enslaved to everything, He wants to set you free. If you've been away from things, He wants to restore you. This pattern of Jubilee and freedom is the gift that God wants to give us. That's what we've been talking about. Now, we've been talking even more specifically about several themes, and we are beginning to introduce what those are. Last week, we talked about the Sabbath and the freshness that comes from Sabbath rest. And as I was on the way out, what I've loved is these last few weeks, this sermon series has provoked a lot of conversations. And on the way out last week, I was talking to someone, incredibly faithful family, and they're just joyful in their faith. But they came up to me and began to ask me some questions. And it helped me begin to think through some of the things that we are talking about here. So here's our verse that we used last week. If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, not going your own ways, you shall take delight in the Lord. But even more so, I want to focus it on just those few words. If you call the Sabbath a delight, you shall take delight in the Lord. That sense of joy. Now here's where the duck feet part comes in. Because this person that came out and was talking to me has a very different personality than from even their spouse. Okay? Where the way their spouse finds joy is going and serving. It is doing. It is witnessing. It is being out with people and energetic in service. The way this other person feels joy is by spending quiet, contemplative time with Jesus. Okay, so you got a doer and you've got a person who is reflective. Okay? One's focusing on Jesus by going out and doing and serving and all of that. And the other is by sitting there and being quiet and contemplative. Now, the one that's out and doing, I know does their devotions daily, and I know the other one serves, but it's more on one side or the other. One serves more, and the other reflects more. Which way is right? Neither is it, okay? What is the key is, it's like duck feet. You know, I don't want someone else's way of being faithful. I want to discover my way. You know, sometimes I have to try on duck feet to see the advantages and disadvantages. But what I want you to see is I hope that all of you are finding ways to be joyful in your service and in your life, because all of us have different ways to do this. Now, and here is where that sense of joy breaks in when the kingdom breaks through. When you find your way of being you. But I want you to listen to the key part of that story I just told, that Jesus others you. Where was both the focus of both people in this family? It was on Jesus. And that's when it all began to make sense. When our focus is on Jesus and not on ourselves, then we begin to experience that joy. Because joy breaks in when the kingdom breaks through, when we begin to see the kingdom in our life. Because it'd be very easy for the doer to be out there and doing and working and never think of God. Do you know people like that? Yeah. You ever been that, even as a Christian? And it's easy to be contemplative, to sit at home and think about the shows that you're watching on TV, right? Okay? So the key is, are we focusing on Jesus or not? And what this person began to do is to tell me about something they've been reading recently about the yoke. Now, Jesus has invited us to be yoked with him, like two oxen. If you're training oxen, the way that you train oxen is to put a young ox in the yoke with an experienced ox. And the young ox begins to learn how to pull. Okay? The young ox begins to learn to do it the way of the other ox. Okay? It's like what discipleship is, right? You begin to learn to look like the other person, the other ox. Okay? And this is the way it is to be with Jesus. It's not that we're supposed to be learning to pull together. It's that we're supposed to learn to look like him. And when we begin to look like him, that passage from Matthew 11 begins to be true. Come to me, all you who are weary, who've been pulling this load through the field on your own and are now carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. See that word rest in there? If we want to find that rest that we are all looking for, it is learning to do it Jesus' way in our lives. So how do we figure out how to do it Jesus' way? How do we learn to look like Him? The people that I were talking about, the one that stayed at home more and the other served often feels guilty for not going out and serving more. Okay? So we can try on someone else's shoes and say, their duck feet, and say, it's not quite working right. Okay? But here's the thing. We all have a reality that we fit into. Okay? Some of us, I was talking to my son Jay. I said, what's your day going to look like on the ship when you get out there in a month or so? And he said, well, my day is you stand your watch for 8 hours, and then you do your work for 8 hours, and then you sleep for 8 hours. So it's a 24-hour day. How much work was in that 24-hour day? Yeah, that's a lot of work. And so you start looking at that and saying, okay, for me, there are other people that have just retired. And they've gone from, 12 hours a day commitment down to commitments of 4, but they get to figure out their day again. And so can you be faithful whether you're working 16 hours a day or 4 hours a day? It's finding your place even within the situations that come to you. And it's figuring out, how do I rest? And it's finding Jesus in every part of your day and every part of your work. It's like, how would Jesus live my life if He were here with me? Okay? Now, we're turning now to today's theme. Okay? And it's by not going our own way. It's learning to do it His way. So we're turning now to our theme for today, if my clicker works. We've been on freshness and rest, but now we're coming to our second theme, which is now family. How do we discover refreshment at home? As I preach through themes and sermon themes and all of that, something always comes out and surprises me. And as I've done this, a theme has emerged, not even though I was thinking about it. But let me weave into it with this. Everybody remembers who Joshua is, right? He was the leader of Israel after Moses. Moses had led the people to the edge of the promised land, but because Moses himself had rebelled against God, God said, you will not be leading them in. Instead, Joshua, my next leader, will lead them in. So at the very beginning of Joshua, one of the most famous verses is, I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So they're getting ready to go in. What is their attitude that they need? Be strong and courageous. Okay? So therefore, says the Lord, pass through the camp and command the people to go in, to take possession of the land that the Lord your God has given you to possess. Let me ask you a question very quickly. What is your promised land? This church, okay? Curtis? Heaven. That is the promised land forever. Okay? Well, let me tell you, on this earth, your promised land is your life. All right? It's not my life. It's not that I want you to do it my way. It's not, well, I look over there and I like the way they live their life and I'm guilty for not doing it that way. It's your life. And that is your promised land. God has given you 10, 40, 80 years of life. God has given you this gift, and it is your promised land. If you have family, your family is your promised land. What do I want my family to look like? And we have some degree of control over that. Okay? Now, that's the very beginning of the book of Joshua. How about the end of the book of Joshua? Joshua is telling the people before he dies, he's at the end of his days, he says, now listen, here's what you need to know. You've got to choose in how you're going to live your life. Choose this day whom you will serve. Whether it will be the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living now. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. This is your promised land. This is your opportunity to choose. Do you hear our first lesson for today? Deuteronomy 6. Okay, it was the end of Moses' days. They were getting ready to go into the promised land. Moses was saying to them, keep reciting these things to your children. Bring them up in the faith. And when they ask you, tell them the story. Because this is your promised land. Okay? Are all the circumstances going to go perfectly? No. But you have the ability to choose today whom you will serve. So here's what I want you to think about. This is what I was going to focus on for the entire sermon today, pretty much. Pull these sheets out. I was looking things up, and I found this sermon by a pastor, Dave Dykes. I don't know who Dave Dykes is, but he surveyed his congregation. He went to some of the most faithful members in his large congregation, and he said to them, tell me what makes your family successful. Okay? And I was going to leave all the blanks and go in and fill those in, and so I've printed it so that you can see all of the blanks. But I want you to just take a look through here. Parenting, what's the key? It's understanding human nature. We say in our confession, we confess that we are by nature, anybody? Sinful and unclean, or in here, stubborn and rebellious. That's your children's nature, because that's all of our natures. Can everybody here look back to when they were a child and agree that from moments to some moments they were rebellious and stubborn? That's our nature. We're not ever going to understand parenting. I was talking to someone recently whose philosophy was all people are basically good. And so we started talking about all the problems in the world. And he said, I got an answer for all of this. Why all of this is where there's problems. It's called sin. And he goes, no, people are basically good. It's not sin. And we talk about problems, and then he goes, but it's all about greed. Greed? Isn't that sin? Oh. So the more we talked, it was like, people really are sinful. But that's us, and it starts with our kids. And so we got to do things like, the general principles, boundaries are established, choice making must be taught, consequences must be explained, natural consequences must be suffered. All right? So all of those things. How about this one? All right? The world says this is how, and isn't this how Americans pretty much do their finances? Okay? This is what the world says you need to be successful. Spend, borrow, repay, save, and give. Okay? Now, isn't it interesting? Is that God's method too? No. God's method looks a little more like this. Okay? Give, repay, save. Spend only on the necessities, not the niceties, and essentially never borrow. Okay? How many of us live more upside down? You notice Jesus is first in that again? I mean, we can go all the way through here. Perseverance, expect trials to come, number 7. But I love this one. Under attitude, under number 7, life is 10% what happens and 90% how we react to it. You ever seen people in the same situations? One is thriving and the other is squashed. Okay? We could keep going all the way through. Laughter, respect. I mean, respect is key in families. Forgiveness, this one's really important. Do you know what I believe is the purpose of families? It's to teach us forgiveness. Okay? Whether it's a church family or our own family, people are occasionally and accidentally and sometimes intentionally going to step on our toes. Okay? And if we don't learn to forgive, our life becomes this small. Okay? So we keep going down there, make memories, take trips, all of those kinds of things. But I want to come to the end of that list. And it gets us back to right where we started, again and again. And that is, if we want to experience joy in our life, it comes from one place, and that is that pattern of Jesus, others, you. I mean, that's what I've learned as I've been walking through this with Jubilee, how clearly everything ties back in. If we want refreshment and rest, we take on Jesus' yoke and learn to walk with Him. Okay? If we want refreshment and rest, we learn to do the Sabbath like He suggests. Okay? If we want a blessed family life, I mean, here's a pastor that interviewed his whole congregation and came down to one thing. What makes great families the best is that Jesus is the first priority. Okay? Again and again and again and again. Okay? Now, so the question is, how do we do that in life? I want to tell you that I have been very reflective lately, nostalgic. Okay? I've got, in our family, our little family, we have got 3 graduations and a big new move and a new job this month. And so to get ready, and I want to thank a lot of you for being able to be at Robbie's graduation the other night. We had a lot of fun. And I put a PowerPoint together for Robbie. And so I looked through all of the pictures over the last many years. And I mean, this reflective state and trying to figure out, all right, how has God worked in our family and enabled us to get to the point where we can say, I love my life and I'm so thankful. Now, we don't have time, and I won't embarrass Robbie by going through all of the pictures again. But I do want to show you just a few. This is Robbie at about 3 hours old, getting his footprint taken. This is him at about 4 months old. My mom used to say, Robbie was so fat he wasn't round, he was square. But here's where I want to pause for a minute today. I began thinking about what was the key to our family. And it's Mother's Day today, and it starts with this woman right here. And even more so, it starts with her focus on Jesus as the center of our family. When we got married, she was much farther ahead in her faith than I was, even though I was the one thinking about going to seminary. And throughout our lives together, she has constantly brought that focus back to Jesus Christ. When we went off to seminary and had zero money, I mean, to go to seminary, you have to quit your job, which means you're earning zero, and instead pay for the privilege of going to seminary. And when we went back to seminary, she said, if we're going to do this, we've got to be all in. we've got to start tithing. And I said, but we can't even make our bills. How are we going to do that? She said, what better time to tithe than when you have absolutely nothing? But even just this past week, when we put together this graduation for Robbie, it was a service of worship. Why? Because Jesus comes first. And that's what she has taught me. And as I've been thinking through this week, another thing popped up. And it was something it was conversations with my son Robbie, and him saying, what affected you in your growing up? And he said, the example that you guys set. It was Mom out on her porch every morning. It was when Mom set rules, she didn't just set arbitrary rules. She explained why each one was to be there. And then I saw on Facebook, Jay posted something, thankful for his parents. And I thought, if I'm going to share anything today, I don't necessarily want to be the one sharing it. And so I asked my son, Jay, if he would share just a little bit about growing up in a family with Jesus as the focus. So, Jay.
Good morning. To everybody who doesn't know me, which might, I messed up the clicker, which might be a lot of people since I've been here for about 4 years. I'm the middle son of Pastor Ed and my mom, Mary Louise. And so what I'm going to do today, I talked with Robbie for a little bit, and we kind of came together and kind of hashed out a kind of a Mother's Day thank you, but also kind of a sermon topic. And I want to, before I start, this is kind of mine and Robbie's reflections on our childhood. And I'm an English major, so I'm very pragmatic and didactic, so I'll tell you everything and won't give you much option to change it. But what that means is that this is not the way of parenting. It's not the way to lead your kids to be faithful. But it's a way, and it turned out to be rather successful. So happy Mother's Day, Mom. I don't like this clicker. Okay, so like I said, I'm an English major, so I'm going to cite all my sources that I'm talking from beforehand. The article my dad said I mentioned is called Homeschooling Blind Spots. If you don't know, my brothers and I were all homeschooled, so my mom has taught for 17 or so years. The other is The Lost Tools of Learning, which is a lecture given by the theologian and author Dorothy Sayers at Oxford University in 1947. And the last one is the Bible. So none of these would actually be articles without that last one. All right, so I'm going to talk about joy parenting, J-O-Y. And I found it funny as I was kind of hashing this out. My mom, I'm going to say this is the approach she used. And the interesting thing is you might say, that's pastor's catchphrase. Well, if you've been like me and been a member of Pastor Ed's congregation for at least 18 plus years, you'll know that he hasn't actually had that catchphrase for that long. So even though this is J-O-Y parenting, that's not the catchphrase really behind it. That's just a good way to maybe summarize it. So I'm going to start off looking at the Y versus the O. And this came from the article that I read, and homeschooling blind spots. If any of you know homeschoolers, they get a bad rap, a bad reputation, but sometimes for good reasons. One of that is a lot of times they're completely unable to relate socially to other people. And one of the reasons for that is why parenting, or you parenting. And this is a very common thing that happens to a lot of people is as you go through life, you make mistakes. I might only be 22, but I know I've already made a lot of mistakes. And when I have kids someday, I don't want my kids to make those mistakes. And so you also have ideas of what, might be good for them in life. One of my biggest regrets is that I stopped playing piano. But if you had told me at 14 years old, Jay, you should continue with piano, I would have told you, like I told my mother, no, I don't want to do that. So you'll have regrets and you'll want your kids to do things. But The why perspective is, I want my kids to do this for me. I want this for me. This is how it reflects on me. We were showing the slideshow of Robbie the other day, and there was a picture of him with this absurdly long mohawk. I mean, it just looked ridiculous. Now, my mother and my father probably thought in the back of their brains, oh my gosh, what kind of child are we rearing? His hair looks absurd. And I'm sure when they let him go out in public, they were probably like, oh my gosh, what are people thinking? But that wasn't the method of parenting they brought to it. The method of parenting they brought was an other's perspective, the child's perspective, which is not, how are people going to look at me as the parent, but how should I focus? And that focus should be on the children. So that's going to be my really quick skipping through the O and the Y section. But most importantly, I want to talk about the J section. Jesus. Example and trust. And this is really how my mom guided us three boys. It was through example and trust. So I'm going to start off with example. So you see how the verse, Matthew 5:16. Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. This verse was how my mom parented us. And the interesting thing about this is not a parenting technique. This is not a 1 + 1 = 2. If I do this, I will have good kids, and I will check that box. And my mom didn't do it like that. My mom lived a Christ-like example because that was her life. There was no other option. It reminded me of a verse in Proverbs 27:19. As a face is reflected in water, so the heart reflects the real person. You can't just magic your way into being an example. You just have to live that life. It has to be you. It has to be your heart. So as Robbie and I were thinking about this, we talked about example. The first thing that my mom did is she went on her porch every morning and prayed, which, as kids, what we learned was we can't go bother mom during this time. That was the first thing. Mom's having a quiet time. This is crucial to a good day's success. And when you're from the ages of, 7 to 14, that's how you view it. But at a certain point, you realize, the reason this is crucial to a good day is not that mom will be happy, but that she's centered. And you can see why that matters. Because then everything else she did as a parent related to that. It related to that example. The second thing, and probably the harder of the two, is trust. And the verse I'm going to base this one on is Proverbs 3:5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding, but rather seek his will in all that you do, and he will direct your paths. Now, this is where I look at the articles I mentioned earlier. See, my mom's understanding of parenting, I don't think was so, didactic that she sat down and she figured out, okay, I will do X, Y, and Z. Granted, she is a doctor, so that's possible, but what I think it really was an understanding of faith, of trust. As a parent, and I'm not a parent, so I can't fully relate to that, but I have been in the military now for 4 years, and I currently work on moral development for 4,000 people. And so I've come to this understanding that you can't just make people do what you want them to do. It's not an easy formula of, I want this result, I know it's best for you, so thus you will do it. It would be nice, but that's not actually how it works. And so, especially with parenting, you have to realize, let me take a step back. Let me trust God. If I can take the others versus the you approach, and I can lead my life by example, and then I'll take that step back. and I'll trust God. And I think with my mother, that was one of the biggest lessons for us. We as kids had a different sort of curfew than most of my friends. And it was because of a trust relationship that we built early on. My mother wouldn't say, be home at 9, you're grounded. It was, all right, Jay, what time do you think you'll be home? When do you think would be an appropriate time? And it would put me in a place where I could then make the decision for myself. Why? Because not only did my mother trust me, but she trusted God in how she had lived her life over a culmination of 18 years. And so this comes then to the Dorothy Sayers article that I talked about. As I said, my mom has homeschooled us, but this is not so much a homeschooling technique, but this is a idea of just how to live life and how to guide people. And I wanted to this is me being very, I want to tell you what I want to tell you, and I'm going to slide it into the sermon for Mother's Day, but this idea, this model of education and of learning, which my mom did intentionally use with us, which is the grammar, the dialectic, and the rhetoric model. This is an ancient model. It's called classical education, modeled by Socrates, further expounded on by the monasteries in the Middle Ages, and then lost in the Enlightenment. So when we look at grammar is that young age when you're learning, when you're memorizing everything. And so what did my mother do with us as kids? We learned, we memorized. I knew the Apostles' Creed and the Lord's Prayer before I even knew what the word trespass meant or what forgiveness was. But I had those ingrained, and I memorized. The next stage is the dialectic, and this is the stage that every parent dreads. The article I was reading by Dorothy Sayers said something to the extent of, in the dialectic, we encourage kids to be argumentative. But everybody says, why on earth would I want to do that? They're already argumentative enough. And Dorothy Sayers says, well then, why not make that constructive? And this is what my mom did. We would have discussions. She would intentionally probe us to really get to the heart of what we were thinking and what we desired. And we would have that back and forth, that conversation, that discussion. And the last stage is the rhetoric. The idea of freedom, that trust. You've now given your kids the tools. They've memorized the creeds. They've memorized that theology. Then they've argued it out. They begin to have that discussion. And the final stage, make your choices. Begin to shape your arguments. And, as I said earlier, this is not the one-way formula to raising good kids. I'm sure there's a lot of parents who definitely did not model this approach. And as I look at my friends at school, there are a lot of them who are more faithful than I am in their walk with God, who did not follow this approach. But this is how my mom did it. And the biggest thing with this is it all focused on Jesus, in her example, in her trust. And my brothers and I'm not going to air dirty laundry, but we've done some pretty terrible things. You might say, oh, you're the pastor's kids, it can't be that bad. No, I've been through 4 years of college. My older brother's been through 4 years of college. We're human beings. We've done things I don't want to talk about in here. But the most important thing is where we stand today. I go to church on a regular basis, not because my parents make me, because frankly, they have no control over what I do anymore. I can walk into that church building on Sunday morning, or I can sleep till noon. It's my choice. My brother Paul is an organist at a church, not because his parents make him, but because he wants his job to glorify God. My youngest brother spends hours every day in this building, not because my parents force him to, but because he wants to glorify God. And that comes down to that rhetoric. Giving your kids the choice, but most importantly, building the foundation for the choice to be made. And so for Mother's Day, and for really all the mothers in the room, I just want to say thank you to my mom for raising me in a life in which I would want to stand up here and thank you. So.
All right, as we close, we have a choice of how to live. Joshua said, go and take possession of the land, and that's your life. But I like what it says in Joshua 18. He says, you've been given this choice to go and take possession of the land. But it says, how long, O Israel, will you be slack about going in and taking possession of the land that the Lord your God has given you? I want to close with a quote that we've been using each week. Why did God create the Jubilee? Because he wanted to set his people free. They agreed with it, they believed it, but they never did it. The key in all of this is Jesus others you. Do you believe that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came down to this earth, sacrificed everything so that he could give everything, that he could give up his life so that your sins may be forgiven and you can live? If we believe that's true, then the secret to life, not just parenting, but the secret to life is giving everything to him. Amen.